2/3 of leakage we found was caused by 3 factors: seal degradation, faulty fill valves, and faulty dual flush valves. And another interesting point from this was that 40% of the leakage was associated actually with the fill valve. So it's not necessarily the flush valve, it's the fill valve, and that could be the float or the inlet mechanism is disrupted by limescale, or it's not set properly, and it actually causes the system to overfill and run into the back of the pan. We found that debris and dirt was not really a significant contributor to the causes of leak, nor were, interestingly, system displacement devices. Of all the WC leaks we found, only 1% of those that were leaking had system displacement devices. So, from this data that we got, and what I've provided really is a snapshot of some of the headlines, we actually held a stakeholder workshop to start to think about what can be done to reduce future wastage from WCs. And I think it's fair to say that the key thing that came from that day was around general awareness of the regulations across the supply chain. And by that I mean that non-compliant products, flush valves, flush mechanisms, etc., can actually be sold but not installed. So as the legislative situation is at the moment, you can obtain non-compliant products, non-compliant with regulation, but they're not meant to be installed. So it was deemed that the legislative situation was actually unsatisfactory and potentially insufficiently policed at this time. However, and this project supports this, there was little product labelling on the mechanisms. So we were unable to determine what proportion of the leakage was due to non-compliant products. There was a number of potential intervention measures that were identified for each of the stakeholder groups, right from government to customer, water companies, plumbers, house builders, etc. But many of these, it was felt, would require regulatory reform. But again, the consensus from the stakeholders was that that's possibly unlikely, or it's deemed unlikely. In that case, WC leakage will probably remain largely an issue for the water industry, for the water companies and their customers. And we found that the most feasible option to tackling this was the continuation of the existing measures to target high consumption users, piggyback on retrofit programs and existing initiatives. And this was supported by some cost-benefit analysis that we actually did on those options. The bottom there was a statement that really came out from the stakeholder group. Without regulatory reform, the issue may be just too hard to tackle, and that all the things that were being identified in terms of potential intervention measures may just be kind of tinkering around the edges. So in summary, we certainly had some recruitment challenges, and getting into people's houses, identifying leaking WCs was really not as easy as we first anticipated. We test the theory that 10% of all WCs leak, and we're 95% confident that the average number of WCs that leak lies between 1.7 and 8.9%. However, the majority of that leakage that we found was quite small, and it's a few very large leaks actually skewed the data quite significantly. Potential wastage though from leakage, again, we feel has perhaps been overestimated in the past, and it could be as low as 1.65% of PCC based on our median values. Interestingly, and this is perhaps something again for the water companies in the way they target going forward, houses built between 1970 and 2000 we found less likely to be leaking, those between 2000 and 2010 more likely to be leaking. Flush valves were strongly associated with leaking WCs. We're not saying they're the causality, but they were strongly associated with leaking WCs, and that the actual cause 2/3 of the leak was caused by 3 factors. Faulty fill valves, however, really are an issue as well, and the highest leakage rates that we found were associated with faulty fill valves rather than any other part of the mechanism that was failing. Access is an issue and will probably be more of an issue in the future as householders and builders move more towards concealed units, concealed systems. So this is something that certainly needs to be bear in mind going forward. And finally, we conclude really that leakage may not be as significant an issue as initially anticipated, based on the data. Thank you.
We have time for questions at the end, but I just wondered whether actually if there are any immediate questions, and then we'll have a bit less time at the end. And I'm saying that because I've got an immediate question. So on the chart where you showed the increase in the distribution, that one, was there any correlation between the far end being metered or not?
No. Interestingly, we found that the level of metering, whether the property was owner occupied or tenanted, didn't actually impact the data.
Okay, so those at the end might have been metered even though they were leaking large volumes. So, oh, sorry.
Yeah, one on the sort of the leakage rate. Could it be that the higher rate leaks are generally fixed quickly by customers anyway? So the ones that we were finding as part of the programme were the lower level leaks that people would tolerate, whereas the bigger leaks, generally, obviously some didn't, but generally would be repaired quite quickly or resolved quite quickly.
I think you're right, Doug. I mean, the development of a leak, I think, is interesting, and you know, we've got some evidence and perhaps suggests that a leak needs to get above 300 litres per day before customers will start to say, oh, I've got a problem here, and start to do something about it. So this data provides actually a snapshot of the situation as we found it. But of course, there are customers out there that are identifying leaks potentially above 300 litres a day that they're fixing. And you know, that's perhaps some follow-on, really, actually looking at lifespan.
Yeah, Gary Moore, Pro Polaire. It's great you actually got in these houses and was able to get access to the toilets. But I mean, looking at wastage as well as leakage, were you able to consider double flushing and you know, filling while they're still flushing? And were you able to actually measure the flush volumes at all? And how these things work?
No, we didn't. That wasn't specifically part of the brief. We were totally focused on the leakage aspect. So, I mean, there's the broader wastage issue around, of course, WCs that are above 6 litres that are still out there in the existing stock, and the double flushing issue, etc. But we were specifically focusing on the leakage aspect.
If I can just add a bit in, I mean, one of the other things we found from doing the project was that as your old siphon, a lot of people kind of handling could look in the siphon and understand it, but the more modern toilets with various cables, rods and everything, they're getting more complicated, and it means that your average DIY or even some plumbers, they're almost accidentally mis-setting them up when they're putting them together because there's so many parts, they've got more complex, there's various loops and joints and things, and we actually believe some of these are about being mis-set up in the first place, so some of your issues come with the additional complexity just of them getting more complicated.
And was there any correlation between the internal and the external overflow, where a leak would go onto the floor as opposed to going into the pan? Did you find any external leaks, for example?
Very few. I think there's the majority of leakage was found that they had internal overflows into the back of the pan.
Martin?
Yeah, fascinating presentation. Thank you very much for that. It's quite interesting actually, because I've been in the industry long enough to go back to when the changes were originally proposed to relax from siphons, which their old-fashioned name was a WWP, which actually means a wastewater preventer. So there was evidence given at that time to the committee that was seeking to relax from siphons to flat valves, etc. To suggest that, and that's when the sort of 5 to 10% figure was first sort of got into mythology. And it was quite anecdotal, but there was some evidence that was presented to suggest that might be an outcome. One of the statements that sort of rang true was that as soon as you move to a valve, as all engineers know, a valve will leak. It's just a matter of time. So your work suggests that houses post 2010, or newer houses if you like, are more likely to have leakage associated with them. So that's quite interesting. So it's kind of that point seems to be coming home, and maybe we might see this problem exacerbate into the future as more and more leaks. And there was two mechanisms. One was degradation of seals. The other one was seals not resetting, which was a temporary factor, which then may happen and then go away. It's intermittent fault. So I don't know whether that came across. The second point was about the move from external overflows, which was sort of, some people loved them, some people hated them. But that was the telltale that you had a fault condition in your inlet valve. So again, that was foreseen in a way, and effectively we're seeing that now, that the internal overflows, much more convenient, but people are less likely to do something about them. And the last thing really was just the low-level leakage. In your view, is that detectable by water meters? I mean, who eventually pays for this? Is it the water supply company, or is it the householder with that very low-level leak that they may not even be aware of, the thin film that continuously leaks? What's your view on that?
That's a good point. Picking up on your first point, we did find some intermittent leaks. We couldn't establish, I think it's fair to say, whether that was due to the valve not setting properly, but that could well be a cause. With respect to the really low-level leaks, we use metadata to back up other measures or other methods of measurement. But I think it'd be very difficult to use metadata alone to identify those leaks because it's very small. In terms of who pays for it, well, I think that's a wider question. I mean, at the moment, it's a customer issue. And the customer has the responsibility, perhaps, to identify that they've got a leak and do something about it.
Yeah, just a very, I think at very low flow, we've looked at the characteristics of flow meters that are used for, and actually they will be undetectable in many cases. So, who pays for it? It's writ large.
Okay. This was question. Tom was first at the back. And then, actually, if we could save the other questions to the end so that we can get through, and then we can come back at the end, if that's okay.
Yeah, it's just following on from Martin's point, really. Actually, the startest point in that presentation for me was that quote at the end about regulatory reform. It's going to be too hard to tackle, and rightly, water companies should be factoring this into their work. But
Alison might say something then.
In your workshop, was there any kind of view on how regulatory change could or should happen?
Yeah, there were a number of potential interventions that were identified, yes. And these were discussed to a point. But I think that the general feeling was that some of those interventions were unlikely to proceed, and they were.
That's not absolving water companies' responsibility, but that's a reactive thing as part of our project.
Yeah. Just let Alison.
Sorry, can I just respond briefly?
Briefly.
I was there at Alison Major from DEFRA. I was there at that workshop. I was slightly surprised by this quote there, because that wasn't quite my feeling that I was picking up there. I know people say change the regulations and it will make everything fine, but I think we did look positively at other ways that people could help as well. So I would slightly push back and say, don't say without regulatory reform everything else is pointless. And I think that both the breakout groups at the session that we had back in the summer also came away with the idea, sense that let's put this into perspective. It is worth spending some time around this, but actually given the figures that we're finding, are there not other areas, sort of like leakage and supply pipes and other things on demand management side that actually we might be better off putting our time and energies into? So just to kind of put it into perspective, given the figures that you're finding.
Okay, thank you. I know there's more questions, but there will be time at the end and also over lunch and in the breakouts. So thank you, Stuart. I'd like to welcome Dave Goff and Rob Lawson to talk about the expanding the evidence base.
Well, first things first, I'm not Dave Goff, I'm Andy Black